June 4, 1942, Midway Atoll. At 10:52 in the morning, roughly 150 miles northwest of Midway, the Japanese aircraft carrier Hiryu was gripped by a quiet, spreading unease. In the navigation room, Lieutenant Mio Kobayashi paused over his chart, his pencil suspended above a set of coordinates that refused to make sense. The numbers were correct, the implications were not. Through the small observation window, Kobayashi noticed Rear Admiral Tamone Yamaguchi examining freshly delivered reconnaissance photographs. His face showed none of the emotions one might expect in battle. No visible rage, no immediate confusion. Instead, there was something far more unsettling. The slow recognition that a core assumption underlying the entire operation had just collapsed. This could not be happening. Less than a month earlier, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, Japanese aviators had watched an American carrier burn uncontrollably. She had been left heavily damaged, listing, and seemingly beyond salvation. Reports were filed, conclusions were drawn. The ship was marked as destroyed. Yet the images now laid out before Yamaguchi told a different story. The grainy photograph clearly depicted an American aircraft carrier in the act of launching planes. Its profile, especially the shape and placement of the island superstructure, left no room for doubt. This was a Yorktown-class carrier. The realization struck with devastating clarity. The United States Navy had not brought 2 carriers to Midway, but 3. That single fact overturned the entire balance of the battle. Japanese planners had calculated victory based on 4 fleet carriers facing only 2 American counterparts. With a 3rd carrier present, the equation no longer held. What had been a carefully prepared trap was, in an instant, turned inside out. 27 days earlier, Japanese air crews had reported this same vessel fatally damaged at Coral Sea. Admiral Takeo Takagi's after-action assessment had been forwarded to Tokyo without hesitation. The General Staff accepted the verdict. USS Yorktown was removed from all operational estimates. From the Japanese perspective, the matter was settled. But Yorktown was not only afloat, she was combat-ready. Her aircraft were already airborne, descending toward the Japanese fleet. Inside Hiryu, confusion spread rapidly through internal communications. The implications multiplied with every passing second. 3 American carriers meant approximately 230 aircraft, not the 150 the Japanese expected. It meant broader search patterns, stronger strike waves, and far less margin for error. It meant that American forces had anticipated the Japanese approach and prepared accordingly. At the heart of this shock lay a profound intelligence failure. Japanese assessments of American industrial and repair capabilities were not merely inaccurate, they were fundamentally flawed. Within the Imperial Navy's worldview, major warship repairs demanded time, precision, and artisanal dedication. Severe battle damage was assumed to require months of careful reconstruction in a major naval yard. A carrier torn open by a 551-pound bomb, its blast ripping through multiple decks, rupturing fuel systems, and destroying internal compartments, was expected to remain out of action for at least 3 months. This belief had seemed mathematically and culturally sound. Accordingly, Japanese planners concluded that only Enterprise and Hornet were operational in the Pacific. Lexington had been lost at Coral Sea. Saratoga was still sidelined by torpedo damage. The new Essex-class carriers existed only on paper and would not join the war until 1943. And yet, reality had moved faster than doctrine. What the Japanese leadership had not fully grasped was the American approach to industrial warfare: rapid, improvised, and ruthlessly pragmatic. At Pearl Harbor, dockyard crews worked around the clock, cutting corners where honor demanded perfection, replacing craftsmanship with speed, and accepting temporary solutions in the name of immediate combat readiness. The appearance of Yorktown at Midway was more than a tactical surprise. It shattered a foundational assumption about how wars at sea could be sustained. In that moment, the Imperial Navy was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. It was not merely facing enemy ships, but an industrial system capable of resurrecting them at a pace Japan had never imagined. By the time this realization fully set in, American dive bombers were already closing in. Japanese naval intelligence had insisted again and again that their calculations were sound. According to every estimate, every report, and every probability model, the Americans should not have been able to act as they did. But theory offered no protection as SBD Dauntless dive bombers screamed out of the sky, lining up their runs on Japanese carrier decks. Inside Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's flagship, staff officers scrambled to rework their assumptions. Numbers were rechecked, timelines were questioned, and slowly an uncomfortable reality took shape. The entire Midway plan, Operation MI, rested on a belief that had already been proven false. The U.S. Navy had accomplished something the Japanese High Command believed impossible. The warning signs had been there before, most notably during the deception and confusion surrounding the Battle of the Coral Sea on May 8, 1942. That battle unfolded roughly 500 miles northeast of Australia. From the Japanese perspective, the carrier strike that morning appeared flawless in execution. 18 Type 99 dive bombers launched from the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku located the American carrier USS Yorktown as she emerged from a sudden rain squall. The strike leader, Lieutenant Commander Kakuichi Takahashi, watched as his pilots released their bombs with precision. One weapon scored a devastating hit near the carrier's island superstructure. The 250-kilogram bomb punched through the flight deck and detonated deep inside the ship, exploding 5 decks below. The flash and smoke column were visible even from 10,000 feet. When the dust cleared, Yorktown appeared mortally wounded. She moved slowly through the water, leaving behind a long oil slick nearly 10 meters wide. Flames burned through jagged openings in her hull, and her bow sagged noticeably. Japanese air crews estimated her speed at no more than 6 knots. To outside observers, the ship looked beyond saving. Pilots returning to their carriers reported that the American flat top was finished, listing heavily and incapable of flight operations. Reconnaissance photographs seemed to confirm the assessment, showing U.S. destroyers closing in, presumably to evacuate survivors. Rear Admiral Takeo Takagi relayed the news to Combined Fleet Headquarters without hesitation. 2 American aircraft carriers, he reported, had been destroyed, Yorktown and Lexington. The message traveled quickly up the chain of command. The Emperor was informed. Naval planners at Kure revised their strategic charts and removed Yorktown entirely from the American order of battle. In their projections for the upcoming Midway operation, she was considered sunk, no longer a factor. But aboard the damaged carrier herself, a very different story was unfolding. Captain Elliot Buckmaster, commanding officer of Yorktown, refused to accept the verdict written by enemy observers. As the ship withdrew from the battle area, she was not crawling at 6 knots, but making nearly 20. Below decks, damage control teams were already performing what would later be described as their first miracle. The bomb strike had been catastrophic by any technical measure. 66 sailors were killed instantly. 6 compartments were obliterated. Elevator machinery was shattered. Fuel tanks ruptured along 30 structural frames. According to naval engineering doctrine, such damage demanded months in dry dock. By standard calculations, returning the ship to combat readiness in the near term was unthinkable. Yet Yorktown began the long journey home anyway. From May 8th to May 27th, 1942, the carrier limped but never stopped on a 3,300-mile voyage from the Coral Sea to Pearl Harbor. That journey revealed something Japanese planners had underestimated: the American approach to industrial warfare. The damage was severe, but the mindset aboard the ship was radically pragmatic. The objective was not perfection, it was speed, function, combat readiness. The unofficial philosophy was simple: make it work, make it fast, and make it capable of fighting again. Chief Carpenter Boyd Mackenzie became a symbol of that approach. Rather than following repair manuals that demanded proper replacement of damaged structural beams, a task requiring dry dock facilities, he ignored doctrine entirely. Steel plates were welded directly over compromised areas, producing repairs that were crude in appearance, but strong enough to serve their purpose. Deep in the engineering spaces, the situation was no better and no less inventive. The explosion had destroyed the number 2 elevator system and crippled 3 boiler rooms. Instead of waiting for replacement parts that did not exist, engineers scavenged what they could from the ship's own machine shop. Components were rebuilt from raw sheet metal. Equipment designed for unrelated systems was adapted, repurposed, and forced into service. Against all expectations, Yorktown maintained speeds of up to 20 knots, far beyond what her condition should have allowed. As she moved steadily toward Pearl Harbor, American submarines sighted her and transmitted her position ahead. The message was clear: the carrier the enemy believed sunk was still alive and racing toward the next battle. Japanese naval intelligence successfully intercepted a series of encrypted American communications. However, they interpreted those messages through their own operational assumptions. When the reports mentioned a damaged carrier proceeding, Japanese analysts concluded the vessel could make no more than 5 to 8 knots. Based on that estimate, they calculated that the ship in question would not arrive at Pearl Harbor until the middle of June, far too late to be repaired in time for the Midway operation scheduled for June 4, 1942. What the Japanese believed impossible was already unfolding. On May 27, 1942, at approximately 1 p.m., the aircraft carrier USS Yorktown entered Pearl Harbor. Her arrival was impossible to miss and impossible to misunderstand. A massive oil trail stretched nearly 10 miles behind her, visible even from Diamond Head. The ship leaned noticeably to port. Thin strands of smoke escaped from hastily applied temporary patches. She looked like a vessel barely holding together. Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch, who had personally observed the damage during the Battle of the Coral Sea, had already sent his professional judgment back to headquarters. Restoring the carrier to combat readiness would require at least 90 days. Under normal circumstances, that assessment would have ended the discussion. But Pearl Harbor in May 1942 was no longer a normal naval base. Since December 7th, it had evolved into something entirely new, a forward repair complex operating at the very limits of feasibility. The massive effort to raise, stabilize, and refloat the sunken battleships after the Pearl Harbor attack had produced a workforce conditioned to think not in weeks or months, but in hours. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz was waiting when Yorktown reached the dock. Unlike his Japanese counterparts, who often directed operations from battleships far behind the front lines, Nimitz personally entered Dry Dock No. 1 while it was still filling with water. He walked through oil-slicked pools, inspecting twisted steel and shattered compartments firsthand. By the time he finished, his trousers were soaked and his hands were blackened with grease and oil. He turned to Captain Claude A. Gillette, the Naval Yard Superintendent, and Lieutenant Commander H.J. Finstad, the base's foremost hull repair specialist. Nimitz issued a single, quiet order: this ship must be ready in 3 days. The dock fell silent. The pause stretched long enough to feel unbearable. Finally, Finstad swallowed hard and answered simply, "Yes, sir." This deadline was not a matter of optimism or bravado. It was driven by intelligence. Only a few hundred yards away, in the basement of Building 1, Station HY, the U.S. Navy's cryptanalysis unit under Commander Joseph Rochefort had achieved a decisive breakthrough. American codebreakers had penetrated the Japanese Naval Operations Code, JN-25. They knew that AF referred to Midway. They knew the planned attack date, June 4. They knew the composition of the Japanese strike force, 4 fleet carriers of the 1st Air Fleet. Most importantly, they knew what the Japanese believed. Japanese planners were convinced that Yorktown had been destroyed. They expected to face only Enterprise and Hornet. That assumption changed everything. Without Yorktown, the United States would face a catastrophic 4-2 carrier disadvantage. With her, even damaged, the odds would still favor Japan, but the balance would no longer be hopeless. Thus, Yorktown's repair was no longer merely urgent, it was essential to national survival in the Pacific. The repair effort began at dawn on May 28, 1942. At 5:30 a.m., before dry dock number 1 had fully drained, and while seawater still swirled around workers' ankles, more than 1,400 men surged aboard the carrier. They came from every department across the base: welders, electricians, machinists, ship fitters, pipe fitters, and sheet metal workers. Many had already been working through the night on other damaged vessels. They would not stop for the next 72 hours. What followed ran completely counter to Japanese industrial doctrine. There were no extended planning sessions, no layered approvals, no rigid trade boundaries. Instead, the work unfolded as controlled chaos. Supervisors made decisions on the spot. Sailors and civilians crossed specialties without hesitation. If a solution worked, even temporarily, it was implemented. The single guiding principle was simple: make her able to fight. The methods used would have horrified Japanese naval architects. Structural compromises were accepted. Cosmetic perfection was ignored. Anything that did not directly affect flight operations or survivability was deferred. But against all expectations, the impossible task moved forward, hour by hour, weld by weld. Pearl Harbor had become a place where time itself was bent, and where the fate of the Pacific War rested on 3 relentless days of human endurance. The bomb strike was catastrophic in scope. A single 551-pound weapon tore a vertical wound through the flight deck and punched its way down 5 internal levels, deforming steel, rupturing compartments, and twisting structural members along its path. Under Imperial Japanese naval repair doctrine, such damage would have triggered a methodical and time-consuming process. Warped steel would be cut away section by section. New components would be fabricated ashore, then carefully fitted back into place. Each deck would be reconstructed according to original specifications. The estimated timeline for such work? No less than 30 days. Pearl Harbor chose a radically different path. Instead of dismantling the damaged sections, engineers left most of the wrecked structure exactly where it was. Enormous steel plates were laid directly over torn metal and welded into place, burying the damage rather than erasing it. Areas weakened by blast force were braced internally with heavy wooden beams scavenged from civilian construction sites across Oahu. What Japanese planners calculated in weeks, the American yard completed in approximately 18 hours. Fuel storage presented another crisis. Near-miss explosions had split fuel tanks across roughly 30 structural frames, allowing aviation fuel to leak and contaminate large sections of the ship's reserves. Japanese procedure required complete drainage, chemical cleaning, internal inspection, and individual repair of each tank, a process expected to consume 2 full weeks. Again, Pearl Harbor abandoned orthodoxy. Contaminated fuel was pumped out as quickly as possible. Cracks and ruptures were sealed with fast-curing concrete normally reserved for emergency runway repairs. Steel patches were welded directly over damaged areas. Tanks too badly compromised to be fixed immediately were not repaired at all. They were permanently sealed and removed from service. Total time spent addressing the fuel system, 11 hours. The machinery spaces posed a final and serious problem. 3 boiler rooms had suffered damage, crippling the ship's superheaters and slashing thermal efficiency by roughly 70%. Maximum speed dropped from 32.5 knots to about 27. Japanese standards would have mandated full replacement of the affected systems before the vessel could be cleared for combat. Pearl Harbor made another calculation. The superheaters were ignored entirely. Engineers accepted the loss of top speed and focused instead on restoring basic propulsion and reliability. Function took precedence over performance. The work required just 14 hours. Inside the shipyard, conditions bordered on the inhuman. Lewis Walters, a 21-year-old electrician at the time, later described the reality. There was no chance to do things the right way. We ran power cables across open decks instead of through conduits. We covered holes with steel instead of rebuilding frames. Everything we did was temporary, crude, and ugly, but it worked. The scale of the effort was staggering. More than 20 tons of steel plate were welded into place. 35 miles of electrical cable were strung wherever space allowed. 400 tons of contaminated fuel were removed. 3 shattered compartments were sealed and abandoned. Continuous arc welding drew so much electricity that power outages rolled across Oahu, plunging neighborhoods into darkness. Workers ate while sparks flew around them. Sleep came in fragments, 15 minutes at a time, leaning against bulkheads before being shaken awake to continue. When the shipyard's demand for power caused hospitals to lose electricity, civilians accepted rolling blackouts without protest. When lumber was needed, construction companies delivered truckloads of timber without contracts, invoices, or questions. From a naval engineering standpoint, many of the repairs bordered on heresy. Split hull seams were forced together with wooden wedges, covered with steel plates, and welded shut, forming what one engineer later described as a metal scab. Electrical standards were abandoned entirely. Cables ran across ceilings, through open hatches, and along passageways with no attempt at concealment or permanence. Then came departure. On the morning of May 30th, 1942, at 9 a.m., USS Yorktown left Pearl Harbor. Shipyard workers were still aboard, welding and wiring as the carrier gathered speed. They would disembark only after the ship cleared the harbor entrance. The air group assembled on her flight deck reflected the same improvisation that had saved the ship itself. Bombing Squadron 3 arrived from USS Saratoga. Torpedo Squadron 3 was rebuilt from scattered survivors. Fighting Squadron 3 consisted of pilots drawn from 3 different units, men who had never trained or flown together. On June 2, 1942, Yorktown reached the rendezvous point known as Point Luck, roughly 325 miles northeast of Midway Island, where she joined USS Enterprise and USS Hornet. The reaction from the other carrier crews was disbelief. Commander Wade McCluskey, Air Group Commander aboard Enterprise, later wrote that everyone knew Yorktown had been badly damaged at the Coral Sea. Most expected her to arrive barely operational, perhaps to remain in reserve. Instead, she was conducting full flight operations, launching aircraft, recovering planes, and maneuvering as if ready for immediate combat. Chief Hull Technician Fingstag would later summarize the achievement in simpler terms. "We sent her back out like a boxer stitched together between rounds. She wasn't pretty anymore, but she could still hit hard." The illusion of certainty. From the deck of USS Yorktown, Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher grasped a reality that Japanese planners had overlooked. The importance of Yorktown was not merely the number of aircraft she carried. Her survival represented something far more dangerous: the collapse of an enemy assumption that underpinned the entire Japanese operation. In his final meeting with his senior officers, Fletcher made his point with clarity. Japanese strategy, he explained, had been carefully engineered over months with one fixed expectation: combat against exactly 2 American carriers. The moment American planes appeared in greater numbers than anticipated, that certainty would vanish. Strategy built on precision would unravel the instant its core assumption proved false. Across the Pacific, aboard the carrier Akagi, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo finalized preparations with complete confidence. His strike force consisted of 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, deploying a total of 248 aircraft. Opposing them, according to all available intelligence, were 2 American carriers with roughly 150 planes. The Japanese air crews were combat-hardened veterans of Pearl Harbor and subsequent operations. Their opponents had yet to secure a single decisive carrier victory. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, famed leader of the Pearl Harbor attack, was sidelined by appendicitis but remained aboard as an observer. In later years, he would reflect on the fragility of the plan. The operation, he wrote, depended absolutely on precise carrier counts, not estimates, not probabilities, but certainty. If that number was wrong, the entire strategy collapsed. Morning of June 4. At 4:30 a.m. on June 4, 1942, Japanese carriers launched 108 aircraft toward Midway Island. The operation began exactly as planned. Nagumo retained an equal number of planes armed and ready, reserved for the anticipated American carrier response. He was confident, but trap was set. At 7:10 a.m., a scout aircraft transmitted a critical message. An American carrier had been sighted. This aligned with expectations. Nagumo ordered his reserve aircraft to be armed with torpedoes, preparing for an anti-ship strike. Moments later, the situation grew less clear. A follow-up report suggested the presence of a second carrier. Still manageable. The Japanese calculations allowed for this. Then, the American attacks began. At approximately 8:20 a.m., Torpedo Squadron 8 from USS Hornet launched its assault. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led 15 obsolete TBD Devastator aircraft straight toward the Japanese fleet without fighter cover. Japanese Zero fighters destroyed every plane. Only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in the water amid the wreckage. Militarily, the attack achieved no hits, but tactically, it forced Japanese fighters down to low altitude. 20 minutes later, Torpedo Squadron 6 from USS Enterprise repeated the assault. 14 Devastators pressed in, 10 were shot down. Again, no torpedoes struck home. Again, Japanese fighters were dragged away from higher altitudes. At 9:15 a.m., a third torpedo attack commenced, this time from Yorktown. As 12 more Devastators approached, Japanese observers began counting. The numbers did not add up. The flow of attacking aircraft exceeded what 2 carriers could generate. Something was wrong. Aboard Hiryu, Admiral Taman Yamaguchi grasped the implication instantly. 3 American carriers were now involved. The entire balance of power had shifted. But recognition came too late. Before new orders could be issued, before the fleet could adapt, another threat materialized above them. The decisive blow. At 10:22 a.m., American dive bombers descended from altitude. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, commanding Yorktown's Bombing Squadron 3, had initially lost contact with the enemy fleet. Rather than abandon the search, he followed the wake of a lone Japanese destroyer racing to rejoin the main force. That decision proved decisive. 17 SBD Dauntless dive bombers emerged over the Japanese carriers at precisely the same moment as dive bombers from USS Enterprise. This convergence was not the result of careful coordination, but of chance. Yorktown's launch had been delayed earlier due to damaged boilers, altering the timing just enough to create perfect alignment. Japanese decks below were crowded with fueled and armed aircraft caught mid-rearmament. Within minutes, the balance of the Pacific War shifted irreversibly. What Japanese planners had ruled out as impossible had arrived overhead, and with it, The end of certainty. From high above the Pacific, nearly 14,000 feet in the air, Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bomber group finally broke through the clouds. What they saw below was astonishing. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers steaming in formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft that were fully armed, fueled, and moments away from launch. Fighters patrolled low over the sea, unaware that disaster was about to fall from the sky. Time moved brutally fast. In less than 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's frontline carriers were fatally wounded. One of them, Soryu, suffered catastrophic damage after being struck by 3 direct hits from the squadron led by Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie. Flames erupted across her deck, explosions tore through her interior, and the fire was so intense it could be seen from nearly 50 miles away. The Japanese response came swiftly but blindly. Their counterattack was launched against what was, in effect, a phantom. On the carrier Hiryu, Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi faced a grim reality. His ship was now the last operational Japanese carrier in the battle. Opposing him were 3 American carriers. Despite the odds, he chose to strike. Every available aircraft was sent aloft, 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters aimed at the nearest American flat top, USS Yorktown. As the Japanese strike closed in, its leader, Lieutenant Mo Kobayashi, studied the carrier below through his binoculars. What he saw unsettled him. The island structure, the deck layout, the overall silhouette. This was Yorktown, the same ship Japanese pilots believed they had already destroyed weeks earlier at the Battle of the Coral Sea. At 12:05 p.m., the attack hit home. 3 bombs slammed into Yorktown, igniting fires, rupturing steam lines, and knocking out power. The carrier slowed, then stopped, dead in the water. For the second time in less than a month, Japanese air crews departed believing they had finished her off. But appearances were deceptive. Even as smoke rose from her decks, Yorktown had already altered the course of the battle. Aircraft she had launched earlier that morning had helped destroy Soryu. By drawing Hiryu's first counterstrike, she spared Enterprise and Hornet, preserving them for the decisive blow that would later eliminate Hiryu itself. What followed was a remarkable demonstration of American damage control. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered an immediate assessment. The repairs performed hurriedly at Pearl Harbor, crude, improvised, and far from elegant, were now being tested under combat conditions. Welded steel plates held firm. Temporary fixes did not fail. Chief Engineer John F. Delaney delivered an optimistic report. The ship had been hurt, but not fatally. The emergency repairs were sound. With 2 hours of work, he believed propulsion could be restored. He was right. Within 60 minutes, 3 boilers were operational again. Fires were brought under control. Counterflooding corrected the ship's dangerous list. By 1:40 p.m., Yorktown was moving at 19 knots and actively refueling and launching fighters. From a distance, she looked shockingly intact. So convincing was this recovery that when Hiryu's second strike arrived at 2:30 p.m., Japanese pilots assumed they were attacking an entirely different, undamaged American carrier. That misunderstanding proved critical. The second wave was led by Lieutenant Tomonaga Juichi, commanding the last torpedo bombers Hiryu could muster, just 5 aircraft. Expecting to find a burning wreck, Tomonaga instead encountered a carrier underway, launching fighters and maneuvering aggressively. His confused radio reports suggested the presence of another American carrier. Japanese staff officers, already shaken, began to believe the Americans might have 4 carriers in the battle, not 3. Tomonaga's torpedoes would ultimately seal Yorktown's fate, but the confusion his report created prevented the Japanese from organizing an effective follow-up. That delay proved fatal. At approximately 5 p.m., dive bombers from Enterprise located Hiryu and struck her decisively, ending Japan's last hope of regaining the initiative. The story did not end there. On June 6th at 1:31 p.m., the Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, penetrated the American screen and found Yorktown under tow. Tanabe fired 4 torpedoes. 2 struck Yorktown, another slammed into the destroyer USS Hammond, which was alongside providing assistance. Yorktown finally rolled over and sank on June 7th. In his patrol log, Tanabe recorded the sinking of an American carrier, possibly Saratoga. Even at the moment of her loss, Yorktown continued to mislead her enemy. The Japanese never fully grasped that the carrier they faced at Midway was the same one they believed destroyed at Coral Sea. That misunderstanding had consequences far beyond confusion. It distorted their assessment of American strength at a critical moment. The numbers reveal the deeper truth. Japanese planners estimated that damage like Yorktown suffered would require 3 to 4 months to repair. American peacetime standards suggested 1 to 1.5 months. In reality, Yorktown was patched and returned to combat readiness in just 72 hours. Nearly 1,400 workers labored around the clock. When she sailed, her combat effectiveness was estimated at 85%. Japan entered the battle believing it faced 2 American carriers. Discovering 3, while assuming there were 4, shattered their operational calculations. 4 Japanese carriers against 2 promised victory. 4 against 3 offered no margin for error. The outcome was catastrophic for Japan. All 4 of its carriers were sunk. The United States lost 1. Yorktown's contribution multiplied beyond her physical presence. Aircraft she launched destroyed Soryu. She absorbed 2 full Japanese air assaults that would otherwise have struck Enterprise or Hornet. Roughly 75 Japanese aircraft were lost attacking her alone. With them went irreplaceable pilots and the core of Japan's offensive air power. After Midway, the Japanese Navy would never again mount a large-scale carrier offensive. Years later, survivors reflected on what Yorktown's presence truly meant. Japanese officers, including Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, acknowledged that her unexpected survival and reappearance disrupted their assumptions at every level. Strategy failed not because of a single mistake, but because one battered carrier refused to disappear. The shock of the unexpected. All operational plans for the coming battle were built on a single assumption. The enemy would field 2 aircraft carriers, no more. Every simulation, every tactical estimate rested on that number. Then came the reports from the lookouts. The sky was filling with torpedo aircraft in numbers that simply did not add up. 2 carriers could not possibly have launched that many planes. At that moment, confusion turned into alarm. The calculations were wrong, the assumptions were wrong. Something fundamental had been missed. By the time the truth became clear, the consequences were already unfolding. 3 Japanese carriers were engulfed in flames. Aviation machinist's mate Tom Cheek of the USS Enterprise later recalled that instant as the moment when American planners realized the battle had shifted beyond anything they had anticipated. The return no one expected. Weeks earlier, the USS Yorktown had been battered at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Her damage was so severe that many assumed she would be out of action for months. Yet, when she appeared again at Pearl Harbor, at a location sailors referred to as Point Luck, the reaction was immediate and emotional. Men who had spent their lives around warships and combat could not contain themselves. Cheers broke out across the harbor. The ship bore the scars of battle, visibly patched and imperfect, but she was afloat, operational and preparing to fight again. Electrician Wayne Morrison later described her as a bruised boxer stepping back into the ring for one more round. She was not beautiful, she was ready, and that was enough. Silence, then applause. When news spread that Yorktown had played a decisive role in the destruction of 3 Japanese carriers before finally taking additional hits herself, an extraordinary scene unfolded back at Pearl Harbor. In the vast naval yard, the noise of machinery faded. Thousands of workers stood still. Then, without coordination, someone began clapping. Within moments, the entire yard, nearly 10,000 men and women, joined in applause. Those few days of work, done under impossible pressure, had altered the course of history. Even if the full meaning was not yet understood, everyone sensed that something irreversible had occurred. Understanding comes slowly. On the Japanese side, clarity arrived far more gradually. Admiral Matome Ugaki, Chief of Staff to Admiral Irisoku Yamamoto, recorded his reflections in his wartime diary. He noted that the sudden appearance of Yorktown at Midway was no coincidence. It was not chance, and it was not fortune. It was preparation. Ugaki concluded that American forces must have had prior knowledge of Japanese intentions. The astonishing 3-day repair of Yorktown was not a miracle, he wrote, but a deliberate response to intelligence. The Americans had acted because they knew they had to. Years later, in 1962, Lieutenant Commander Tanner visited Pearl Harbor and was shown Dry Dock No. 1, the very place where Yorktown had been restored just enough to fight again. He stood in silence for several minutes, absorbing the scale of what had been done. Finally, he spoke with quiet clarity. Japan, he said, had not been fighting a single country. It had been fighting an idea. That with enough effort, speed, and organization, almost anything could be made possible.
2 philosophies, 1 outcome. Japanese naval thinking placed immense value on perfection. Craftsmanship, precision, and honor in detail were paramount. A damaged vessel, by this logic, should not return to service until it had been fully restored. Quality outweighed time. The American approach was fundamentally different. Ships did not need to look flawless, they needed to function. Repairs were judged not by elegance, but by effectiveness. Speed mattered more than symmetry. Adaptation mattered more than tradition. A ship that could fight today was infinitely more valuable than a perfect ship available months later. This philosophical divide extended far beyond ship repair. Japanese aircraft were masterpieces of engineering, finely tuned, carefully assembled, and difficult to replace. American aircraft were designed to be good enough, produced in vast numbers, interchangeable, and repairable with whatever tools or parts were at hand. One side pursued excellence in isolation, the other pursued effectiveness at scale. Intelligence is only power if you can use it. The code-breaking work of Station Hypo provided the Americans with critical insight into Japanese plans. That intelligence alone, however, was not sufficient. Without Yorktown, Admirals Nimitz and Fletcher might have judged the risk too great and avoided decisive engagement. Commander Joseph Rochefort later summarized the lesson succinctly. Intercepting enemy communications meant nothing unless the fleet had the capacity to act on what it learned. Yorktown made action possible. The shipyard workers who restored her under extreme conditions were, in that sense, just as vital to victory as the cryptographers who broke the codes. A lasting transformation. The emergency repair of Yorktown reshaped naval doctrine for generations. Damage control philosophy shifted permanently. Speed became more important than perfection. Practical function replaced visual form. Innovation was encouraged over rigid procedure. The lesson was simple but profound. Wars are not won solely by superior weapons or heroic moments, but by systems that allow knowledge, labor, and decision-making to move faster than the enemy. In the end, Yorktown delivered a mathematical truth. A nation capable of restoring a crippled carrier in 3 days could not be defeated by an opponent that required 3 months to do the same. From that moment on, the outcome of the war was no longer a matter of spirit or destiny. It was a matter of time.
The birth of a new wartime measure. From the wreckage of USS Yorktown, a new benchmark quietly took shape. The lesson was simple yet radical for its time.
If a vessel could still float, it could be returned to battle. What unfolded in Pearl Harbor was more than an emergency repair. It became a public demonstration of American industrial resolve. The men who restored Yorktown in just 3 days were the same kind of workers who would soon astonish the world by launching Liberty ships in a matter of days, assembling B-24 bombers in barely over an hour, and ultimately delivering the most complex project in human history, the atomic bomb, in less than 4 years. Yorktown was not an exception, it was a preview. A reunion decades later, in 1985, 43 years after the Battle of Midway, survivors gathered in Hawaii to commemorate the conflict. Among them were 2 men whose lives had intersected unknowingly in 1942. Lewis Walters had been an electrician at Pearl Harbor, stringing power cables almost non-stop for 72 exhausting hours. Tom Lee had been a gunner aboard Yorktown, standing watch over weapons that relied entirely on those cables. When they met, Lee grasped Walter's hand and said plainly, "Your wiring is why I'm alive." He explained that when Yorktown absorbed its first bomb hit, the ship's main electrical system collapsed. Yet the emergency lines, the ones Walters and his team had rushed into place, held. Power returned. The guns stayed active. Walters later reflected on the mindset of the repair crews. They worked knowing that every weld, every splice, every hurried fix might determine whether someone else's child came home alive. That belief guided every decision they made. Admiral Nimitz's judgment. After the war, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz offered what became the definitive evaluation of those events. He argued that the 72 hours Yorktown spent in dry dock were among the most consequential days of the entire Pacific War. Not because the repairs were extraordinary, though they were, but because of what they symbolized. Those 3 days revealed a nation in motion, a democratic society capable of rapid coordination, workers fully committed to a common cause, and an industrial system unleashed without hesitation. Japan had sailed toward Midway, expecting to confront the America they believed existed, slow to react, internally divided, cautious to a fault. Instead, they encountered the America that actually stood before them, fast-moving, resilient, and unified. Yorktown was the evidence. Japanese planners were certain the carrier had been neutralized, yet it appeared at Midway seemingly restored. When Japanese pilots spotted Yorktown's aircraft rising toward their fleet, they saw more than enemy planes. They were witnessing American resolve given physical form. More than a repair. The dockyard crews did not merely return a damaged carrier to service, they revealed a national trait that would ultimately decide the war. In those 3 days, Pearl Harbor's workforce proved that in the American industrial mindset, impossible was not a verdict, it was a delay. The arithmetic of victory. When the outcome is measured objectively, the scale of the return becomes clear. Cost: 72 hours of non-stop labor, approximately 1,400 workers, roughly $2.2 million in materials, 3 days diverted from other critical repair projects. Return: 1 Japanese fleet carrier destroyed by Yorktown's air group, 2 major enemy attack waves absorbed, over 320 Japanese aircraft eliminated, approximately 3,500 Japanese personnel lost, the permanent collapse of Japan's offensive carrier capability. Beyond the battlefield results, the implications were profound. American repair capacity exceeded Japanese intelligence estimates by roughly 30-fold. Rapid repair doctrine was validated in combat. New damage control standards were established. Across the nation, factories and shipyards drew inspiration from what had been accomplished at Pearl Harbor. The question Japan could not answer. One mystery lingered for Japanese planners. How had the Americans known Yorktown needed to be repaired at such speed? How did they anticipate that Midway would erupt precisely on June 4th? The real explanation, that American codebreakers were reading Japanese communications almost as they were sent, would remain classified for decades. Yet even without that knowledge, Yorktown's presence at exactly the right moment should have revealed the truth. The United States understood Japan's intentions in full. A live-in doctrine. The legacy of Yorktown did not end in 1942. The modern U.S. Navy continues to teach its lesson. Speed outweighs perfection, flexibility defeats rigid planning, and the enemy will never wait for ideal conditions. Today's damage control philosophy, focused on restoring function immediately rather than achieving flawless repair, can be traced directly to those 72 hours in Pearl Harbor. Every sailor learns the story. Every damage control specialist knows the standard. Captain Buckmaster's final word. Yorktown's commanding officer later summarized the episode with characteristic clarity. The Japanese, he said, expected Americans to follow established rules about how long repairs should take and what was considered realistic. But we weren't interested in their rules, he explained. We made our own, and our only rule was this: Yorktown would fight at Midway. What happened to USS Yorktown after the Battle of the Coral Sea was not a miracle in the romantic sense. It was something more grounded, more chaotic, and ultimately more powerful, a demonstration of how American industry functioned under extreme pressure. There was no perfect plan, no elegant solution. What existed instead was urgency, creativity, and a workforce unwilling to accept limits. At Pearl Harbor, dock workers, engineers, and technicians faced a ship that by all conventional standards should not have been combat-ready for months. Structural damage, ruptured plating, compromised systems, every inspection revealed new problems. Yet the goal was not perfection, the goal was speed. If something could be stabilized rather than replaced, it was stabilized. If a system could function well enough to fight, that was enough. The work was rough. Temporary steel plates replaced torn hull sections. Cables were rerouted in ways no manual would recommend. Repairs were performed simultaneously, often without full documentation, simply because there was no time. It was not a restoration, it was controlled survival. When Yorktown left the dock on May 30th, she was no longer the same vessel that had entered the Coral Sea weeks earlier. She was a hybrid, part original construction, part emergency engineering, part collective resolve. In many ways, she mirrored the nation that sent her back into combat. Scarred, altered, but unbroken and operational. At Midway, the Japanese fleet did not encounter only 3 American aircraft carriers. They faced the physical outcome of industrial resolve transformed into steel, wiring, and patched hull plating. That confrontation was made possible by a decision taken 72 hours earlier, the decision to redefine what possible meant under wartime conditions. Today, Yorktown rests more than 16,600 feet beneath the Pacific Ocean. Discovered in 1998 by oceanographer Robert Ballard, the ship remains upright on the seabed. Time has preserved the evidence of her final days, the scars of battle, the rushed reinforcements, the welded plates supplied in Pearl Harbor. These were not hidden or erased. They remain visible proof of function over form. At Pearl Harbor's Dry Dock No. 1, a plaque quietly commemorates those hours. It notes that within 3 days, American workers returned Yorktown to fighting condition, directly influencing the outcome of the Battle of Midway. No names are listed, no individual credit is given. The achievement belonged to the collective. The phrase, "awakening a sleeping giant," is often associated with Pearl Harbor. But Midway revealed what that giant could do once fully mobilized: adapt instantly, move unpredictably, and refuse to be constrained by expectations. Lieutenant Commander Tanabe, who later delivered the fatal blows to Yorktown, reportedly realized too late that his target was not merely a damaged ship. It was a mindset, a system that treated impossibility as a temporary obstacle rather than a final verdict. The men and women who completed those repairs did not receive medals. Their work produced no headlines. Once Yorktown sailed, they returned to the docks and began repairing the next damaged vessel. Their contribution to victory came not in dramatic moments, but in accumulated hours of labor, repeated again and again. Yet those 72 hours mattered. They demonstrated that speed could outweigh perfection, that innovation could emerge from constraint, and that industrial power was not defined solely by output, but by determination. Sending a visibly damaged carrier into battle sent a clear signal. Defeat was not something the United States would accept, not strategically, not psychologically, and not practically. The lesson of those 3 days endures. When resources are limited and time is short, progress belongs to those who act, adapt, and refuse to wait for ideal conditions. Yorktown sailed to Midway not as a flawless warship, but as proof that resilience, when organized, can alter history. When USS Yorktown reappeared at the Battle of Midway, it was not merely a tactical development on the naval chessboard. It was a statement. Her presence signaled something far deeper than surprise. It revealed the true strength behind America's war effort, a strength forged not in combat alone, but in shipyards, workshops, and sleepless nights fueled by resolve. The most decisive force at work was not an explosive or a weapons system. It was human effort. Skilled hands, welding arcs, improvised solutions, and an unforgiving deadline transformed the impossible into reality. In the span of just 3 days, American shipyard workers achieved what conventional timelines deemed unattainable. They did not restore a ship to perfection, they restored it to purpose. Those 72 hours rewrote assumptions about what industrial power could accomplish under pressure. Speed replaced ceremony, function took precedence over appearance. The urgency of an approaching battle outweighed the comfort of established routines. Every decision was guided by a single question: will this ship fight again, now? When Japanese naval commanders later reported their disbelief at seeing Yorktown at Midway, they were reacting to more than a miscalculation in intelligence. What they encountered was a glimpse of a different system at work. A system where adaptability defeated hierarchy, where initiative overcame rigidity, and where voluntary effort proved more powerful than enforced obedience. The contrast was stark. One side emphasized meticulous planning and rigid timelines. The other embraced flexibility, rapid decision-making, and problem-solving under extreme constraints. One pursued technical perfection. The other pursued victory. On June 7, 1942, Yorktown was lost to the Pacific. Her hull slipped beneath the waves, but her impact did not vanish with her. What endured was the lesson she carried into history. From that point forward, the American war effort would repeatedly rely on rapid repairs, compressed schedules, and bold improvisation, strategies that traced their origins back to those frantic days in May. The legend of the ghost carrier that unsettled enemy pilots was not born of myth or illusion. It was rooted in a very real phenomenon. A workforce empowered to act, trusted to decide, and motivated by shared purpose rather than compulsion. The men and women who labored on Yorktown did not believe they were creating a defining moment of the war. They believed they were meeting a deadline. Yet in meeting that deadline, they demonstrated a principle that extended far beyond one ship or one battle. They showed that free people, united by necessity and trust, could compress months of work into days. That innovation could outperform procedure. That urgency, when guided by skill, could bend reality. Those 3 days in dry dock did not simply return a carrier to service. They altered the balance of the Pacific War. They proved that industrial democracy, when fully mobilized, could outpace and outthink its adversaries. The true legacy of Yorktown is not found at the ocean floor. It lives in the idea that progress does not always require perfection, that solutions emerge fastest when people are allowed to act decisively, and that time itself becomes a weapon when measured in hours rather than months.
This was the real power behind the arsenal of democracy, not machinery alone, not ideology alone, but the fusion of both through human will. Workers who chose to push beyond limits, not because they were ordered to, but because the moment demanded it. That belief, forged in steel and urgency, helped turn the tide at Midway. And long after the guns fell silent, it remained a defining advantage, proof that when free people commit fully to a common goal, even the impossible becomes merely the starting point.